everyone, and welcome. We're so delighted that you have joined us this evening for Reimagining Religious Freedom, Rights, Responsibilities, Respect. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, president of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, and curator of the Religious Freedom Mobile Institute. Before we move forward in tonight's program, it is only appropriate that I acknowledge that I come to you as a guest on Native Accostian lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey tribes near our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. At the same time, on this International Religious Freedom Day, I want to affirm the words found in Article 18 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was drafted in 1948, that they are matters of freedom, human dignity, and justice. And it reads in part, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private. And yet, we cannot forget that Articles 1 and 2 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights reminds us that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. And yet we sit here tonight for this conversation. I also want to remind all of us that it was on this day 4 years ago when 11 people were killed at the Tree of Life Synagogue. It is in their memory and the thousands of others that have been victims of religious privilege, religious discrimination, and targeted, that the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, along with all of our incredible partners, remain committed to reimagining the possibilities for all people to live in a world where religion is not used to discriminate based on how a person shows up in society. And so with that, I say to you, welcome to tonight's program. Speaking of partners, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our partners and our sponsors. This virtual conference has been made possible due to the generous support of so many organizations and individual donors that you see on the screen before you. We want to thank the Center for Community Engagement and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary, Chicago Theological Seminary, Wake Forest School of Divinity, the First Amendment Museum, Interfaith Alliance, the National Council of Jewish Women, Shoulder to Shoulder, Wesley Theological Seminary, the Open Church of Maryland, Union Presbyterian Seminary, Star King School for the Ministry, Vanderbilt Divinities, Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, and our friends at Network Lobby. They made this event possible with their donations and with their support. And for that, we say thank you. Thank you to all of you. Additionally, I want to thank and acknowledge those that are working behind the scenes tonight and that will work behind the scenes over the next 2 days. And they include our team members here at the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, Michael Vazquez, Beth McMahon, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, Katya Pedyesh, and also our friends Sophie Hersher and Dorsky, who made a lot of the graphics possible for us, and Blair Forlaw, who helped set the foundational tone in our planning process. I want to thank all of you for being here and for registering for this event. But I want to also tell you a little about who we are as the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. We are a theological think tank and education organization that is committed to living our faith and advancing justice issues. And in that, we look at the intersections of race, religion, and politics by reimagining religious freedom that prioritizes all and is inclusive of all. That is people that are religious and non-religious. We look at this knowing that this is a human dignity issue. We offer public programs like this one, workshops, and other opportunities for you to mobilize and to take action in your communities around the issues that impact all of us. And I'm grateful for the board of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation for supporting us in this work. And you'll hear more about our board members, and you'll actually hear from some board members even starting tonight. So I'm so thankful to all of the board members that continue to support us in the work that we do. In 2021, I worked for a different organization, but there was a volunteer at Americans United that wrote this quote. And I was like, this is so good. And I want to center tonight's conversation by thinking about this. Mr. Miller wrote, in response to a SCOTUS decision, he wrote, conservatives are just as liberal as anyone else in the way they live their own lives. The difference is in the way they impose rules on others. They are liberal in how they judge themselves, but conservative in how they judge others hypocritically. In their own lives, they want to be free from the government telling them what to do. But as soon as they get their hands on the levers of power in government, they immediately use the government to impose rules on and laws on everyone else. They don't want government restricting their own freedom, but they will use government to restrict the freedom of others. And in the most invasive and privacy violating ways, telling someone what God to worship, telling women what they can and can't do with the most private parts of their bodies, telling people that they can and cannot marry. The pro-lifers are pro-gun and impose the death penalty on others. How is that less government? It's less government for them, but more government for others. Over the next couple of days, as we explore this topic of reimagining religious freedom, rights, responsibilities, and respect, I want us to think back to the Williamsburg Charter of 1986, when people from different religious identities came together to try to figure out, how do we acknowledge the rights and protect the rights of not just ourselves, but for our entire community? And so this is how we lean into this conversation for the next couple of days. I want us to think about our rights, but the rights of everyone else. Religious freedom is a human right. It's a constitutional right for everyone. But we all have a responsibility to protect that right for each other. And we have to do so engaging in respect. And I want to thank Dr. Charles Haynes for being a mentor to help me in that process of understanding the Williamsburg Charter and the work that we're even doing and expanding through these public conversations. So with that, I want to introduce to you our moderator for this evening's conversation, Michael Vazquez. Michael Vazquez is a public theologian and policy strategist. Michael is a community organizer and a communication strategist, as well as a public theologian, serving as an advisor to nonprofit organizations, government institutions, political candidates, religious and spiritual leaders, and even the private sector. Michael is an advisor with public-private strategies, supporting a wide-ranging portfolio, including directing the development of an online tool to empower and connect business owners of color with contracting and grant opportunities related to bipartisan infrastructure, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. Additionally, Michael supports the Public-Private Strategies Institute, serving as an advisor to the Emerging Voice Table, a multidisciplinary funding table that aims to engage and empower voices of small business, rural, and faith-based organizations. And we're so delighted that Michael has joined us tonight after also serving as an advisor to Auburn Seminary and the work that he continues to do to support progressive interfaith initiatives around this country at state, local, and national levels. And we're delighted that he is our project manager for the Religious Freedom Mobile Institute. And Michael holds a master's in theological studies from Duke University's Divinity School. And he has appeared in the National Catholic Reporter, Georgetown's Berkeley Forum for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, USA Today. And Michael was also named one of the 21 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress in 2021. So with that, I would like to introduce to some and present to others our moderator for this evening, Mr. Michael Vazquez.
Thank you, Sabrina. You said way too much, but I appreciate it. Thank you. It is so lovely to see all of you tonight, whether you're watching this live or you're watching the recording. We are grateful. A lot of time and energy and love was poured into bringing this institute together for this very particular moment in our nation's history. We will have a long discussion this evening about what Christian nationalism is and what that means for our rights, for our democracy, and for our future. We are working together diligently to carve out a pathway for an inclusive democracy that works for every member of American society. And we need to have a serious conversation about what are the forces that oppose the work for justice, the work for reconciliation, the work for equity, the work for creating a society that is holistic, that is just, that serves everyone, and is rooted and grounded in a vision of liberation. To begin our night together, we will have an opening plenary with the illustrious Dr. Obery Hendricks, who is a lifelong social activist. Dr. Obery Hendricks is one of the foremost commentators in the intersection of religion and political economy in America. He is the most widely read and perhaps most influential African-American biblical scholar writing today. His recent book, Christians Against Christianity, after which tonight's session is named, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith, has gathered wide acclaim, so much so that the Dr. Cornel West calls him one of the last grand prophetic intellectuals. A widely sought after lecturer and media spokesperson, Dr. Hendricks' appearances include CNN, MSNBC, CBS, Fox News, the Discovery Channel, PBS, BBC, Japan Television, and the Bloomberg Network. We are grateful for Dr. Obery Hendricks gracing us with your time this evening and leading us as we engage in a conversation this evening about Christian nationalism, the threats we face, with the hope that remains to carve a pathway out for justice, liberation, and peace. Without further ado, Dr. Obery Hendricks.
Okay, I guess I've learned how to do this. To unmute myself, forgive me. I have a lot of skills, but being on top of, of these media is not included within them. But thank you so much, Brother Vazquez. And I am really honored to have been invited to speak here. at this great conference and this great organization that I admire so much, and to be in dialogue with people that I admire so much. In addition to my new brother and friend, Brother Vazquez, I'm so glad to see my brilliant colleague Amanda Tyler, who is in the trenches fighting for the freedom of all people. And also my dear friend, longtime friend and brother, Reverend Paul Raushenbush, for whom I have so much respect and affection. And also I am so thrilled to be here with Dr. Sabrina Dent, who was a student of mine, but is now a colleague and perhaps even a teacher. And it just brings things full circle for me. But this evening, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about some aspects of Christian nationalism. My talk's not going to be a comprehensive analysis of Christian nationalism. I think there's some things that need to be said, basic things that are more perspectival. And I look for getting maybe a bit more granular in the discussion. But for now, I'd like to speak about Christian nationalism and the threat it poses to us. Several generations after the death of Jesus, the faith that he had preached to his beleaguered countrymen had begun to spread beyond its Galilean and clandestine beginnings. This spread was not only in geographical terms, but also in cultural terms and even religious ideations. Those who were attracted to the nascent faith in these new environments knew little about Jesus' own setting in life, about the problems and crises and conditions that he so boldly confronted in his brief ministry. Nor did they know anyone who had encountered Jesus in the flesh, or anyone who had known anyone who themselves had known anyone who had encountered Jesus in the flesh. As a result, many found themselves in a space in which they could appropriate Jesus and the meaning of his ministry according to their own interests and needs. So many hyper-spiritualized him, a process which parenthetically continues today in too many of our churches that have become citadels of Jesus personality cults, obsessed with the person of Jesus while giving short shrift to the bold precepts he taught. But back to the Docetus. These early folks dismissed these early believers, this cohort of early believers dismissed the radical Jesus who talked about the poor and their needs more than anything except God. And they discussed the radical who called for the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, which, by the way, effectively meant doing away with the Roman state under whose oppressive heel Jesus and his people suffered. For many, Jesus even ceased to be a Jew. And many had absolutely no use for the political reality that Jesus, a dissident Jew, had been publicly tortured and executed as a vicious enemy of the Roman state. How could he be the Son of God and Savior of the world if he couldn't even save himself, they asked. No, he couldn't, they decided. Their Jesus, the Son of God, couldn't possibly have been executed as an enemy of the state. Eyewitnesses to his crucifixion just could not have seen what they thought they saw. And what they saw could really have been Jesus. The Savior of the world just couldn't have been crucified. So it must have been a spirit that was impaled, or a phantasm who only seemed to have a material body. Yes, it must only have seemed to be Jesus. Jesus, the Son of God, was not crucified on the cross, they cried. This denial that Jesus really was crucified, that he had been executed as a political dissident, this belief that he only seemed to have been crucified, came to be known as Docetism, from the Greek term dokein, which means to seem. This belief was a real problem for the faith and the faithful, because if the crucifixion of Jesus was only an illusion, if he only seemed to have been crucified, then the salvation they thought to have been wrought by the cross would also have had to be an illusion. Thus, Docetism, the belief that a phantasm died on the cross in place of Jesus, struck at the very heart of the faith. It denied the salvific power of the cross, which was a blasphemous assertion in Christian terms that struck at the very heart of the faith. For as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. The writer of the Johannine letters, particularly 1 and 2 of 1st and 2nd John, went straight to the heart of the matter. He declared that anyone who makes any declaration in the name of the faith that in actuality is counter to the faith is in reality an opponent of Christ. In other words, they are an anti-Christ. And there will be many antichrists, 1 John declared, who will be moved by what he called a spirit of antichrist. I began here because as we engage right-wing Christian evangelical and white Christian nationalism, it must be clear from the outset that in our discussion, we're not simply talking about folks who profess Christianity with benign differing opinions about the faith that are still anchored in the faith. What we are engaging tonight is a movement that is motivated by a deeply held spirit of denial and opposition to the very core of the gospel. It is similar in a basic sense to that which John called a spirit of antichrist, for it is an oppositional ideology that militates against the most basic tenets of Christian faith, an ideology that is dedicated to dominating the world, not loving the world. In this sense, what we are faced with
a talented child or a child that's going to college or
okay, it seems like I was muted for a moment. Okay.
You should be all set now.
Okay, thank you. Rather than love and inclusion, this movement loudly, even proudly, traffics in hate speech and exclusion. Neither justice or love are in its vocabulary. I mean, you never hear them talk about justice or love. Like the Docetists of old, they dismiss the aspects of the gospel that do not suit their interests or disposition. But unlike the Docetists of old, the breadth of the tenets of the faith that they oppose, that they ignore, that they redefine to suit their own purposes, is far more expansive. They would have us believe that the social justice imperative of the Bible is pervasive commands to offer hospitality to immigrants, to care for the poor, as well as the political radicality of Jesus and his commandment of love your neighbor as yourself, are not what they seem. That they are instead figments of a mistaken liberal biblical imagination, or worse, the deadly misleadings of the devil. And I've been amused, I must say, for quite a while now, listening to some of the, let me say, not fully enlightened figures on the right wing, preachers talking about what devils we are and how we are misled by the devil. It's funny to me because I don't know anything about a devil. And even if I did, I wouldn't admit it, but you know. Anyway, in this sense, Christian nationalism is, again, essentially an anti-Christian movement, a movement that has been possessed by a perversely oppositional spirit of Antichrist to support and even lead assaults on truth and decency, possessed to consign expressions of hate rather than striving to spread love, to spew spiteful invective against other faiths rather than accepting them as children of God, and most appallingly, to extol Donald Trump as God's chosen vessel to grace the highest corridors of earthly power, even as his malevolent words and deeds dishonor God by sowing chaos and deadly disunion among us. Rather than striving to build harmony in the name of Christ, this movement applauds the construction of spiteful walls of division. Rather than standing on moral consistency, they offer shameless excuses for the rankest of hypocrisies, such as Trump's lies and admitted serial molestations of women, and of more recent vintage, their defenses of Herschel Walker's myriad lies and transgressions. Rather than suing for peace, they embrace the death-dealing agenda of the NRA and the attacks of domestic terrorists and insurrectionists, about whose deadly deeds they are silent. And if they say anything at all, they perversely call them patriots. Rather than spreading gospel affection, they demonize Muslims, liberals, and progressive Christians, and accuse those who question their lies by painting them with absurd, murderous conspiracy theories. But what is this movement? In my latest book, I write about right-wing Christian evangelicalism, and I know the occasion of this evening is to discuss Christian nationalism. But there is really no negligible difference between the two in my understanding. So what is Christian nationalism? It is essentially the ideology that the United States is intended by God to be a Christian nation. The purveyors of this ideology embrace it like it is holy writ, and they ignore all evidence that contradicts this misreading of history, no matter how compelling or historically factual, even including the testimony to the contrary of critical figures in the founding of this nation like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Christian nationalism is best understood as a political ideology then that holds that America's government is not legitimate, nor can it ever be, until its laws and policies are fully consistent with the Christian nationalists' narrow, convoluted readings of the biblical text. But their goal is not primarily to hew to the Bible, no matter what they claim. Its primary goal is to force every aspect of American life to genuflect at the altar of their anti-Christian ideology. In this sense, they are more than Christian nationalists. They are Christian supremacists. They justify their supremacist intentions by invoking the command in Genesis 1:28 to have communion over every living thing that moves on the earth. And in Matthew 28:19, go and make disciples of all nations, as their own divine mandates to take control of all political institutions and offices in America, if not the world. But their use of the Bible to support their supremacist claims are bogus. The Genesis passage, written thousands of years before the Christian era, assigns dominion over the created world to humanity in general, not to any one particular group. And in Matthew 28:19, the Greek term mathetes, from which disciple is translated, means student, pupil, apprentice, one who engages in learning through instruction from another. In other words, the Matthew passage instructs believers to bring the meaning of the gospel to the world, not to bring the world under Christian domination, and certainly not under the domination of a particular group of Christians. Yet that is their goal. In a website post, Franklin Graham maintained that God is calling for a, quote, Christian revolution in America, unquote. That, of course, will firmly place control of this nation, in his mind, in Christian nationalist hands. Pat Robertson, on his 700 Club television show, declared outright that God's plan for his people is to take dominion. What is dominion, he says? Well, dominion is lordship. God wants his people to reign and rule with him, he concludes. That means God is firmly ensconced in heaven, but Christian nationalists will be firmly ensconced in every office of worldly influence and power. Pardon me. This is their goal and their vision. But this movement is not only nationalist and supremacist, Christian supremacists, hell-bent on dominating and dictating every contour of American life for us. Christian nationalism is also a racist movement. Not only racist by default, because America at its very roots is racist, the anti-Christian right-wing nationalist movement, Christian nationalist movement, the anti-Christian right-wing Christian nationalist movement that bedevils American life today began as a fervent public movement that sought to perpetuate white supremacy and racial segregation quite consciously. In 1970, President Jimmy Carter's IRS issued a statute that revoked the federal tax exempt status of all higher educational institutions that practice racial segregation and discrimination as a matter of policy. In 1971, the Supreme Court upheld this statute. Bob Jones University was an avowedly, rabidly, proudly racist college in South Carolina, which was among the institutions that under this ruling could no longer avail itself of favorable tax status unless it eschewed its racist policies. This outraged Jerry Falwell, Ed Dobson, Paul Weyrich, and other right-wing evangelical bigwigs who immediately jumped to Bob Jones University's defense. They fought tooth and nail in every venue they could find to protect the right of Bob Jones University and every other educational institution to practice white supremacy and racial segregation in education as long as they chose to. Out of this vociferously pro-white supremacist movement emerged the moral majority under the leadership of the white supremacist Jerry Falwell and his cohort of defenders of white supremacist purposes. And the moral majority is essentially the incubator in which today's Christian nationalist movement was born. And this movement seeks, it says, to make America great again. That is, it wants to turn the clock back to an older status quo, which includes an older racial status quo, when people of color were less troublesome to them, when we had fewer rights and less political power and seemed to know our place better. This is reflected in their ongoing support of a hateful racist ex-president and their attacks on initiatives to teach the history of how Black folks struggles in America, as well as their embrace, white supremacist embrace of hateful figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Louis Gohmert and Louisiana Congressman John Kennedy and this whole other host of buffoons that they support. So make no mistake, this white Christian nationalism is a cancer not only on the body of Christ, but also on the soul of this nation. It is racist and it is hateful and it is non-biblical, and in a very profound sense, it is anti-Christian. And let me explain a little to you why is anti-Christian. Let me explain to you really the gist of why it's anti-Christian as I relinquish my seat as an academic scholar and now begin to speak to you as a believer and a man who believes that we are in a war between life and death against this onslaught of white Christian supremacist nationalism. The greatest sin of Christian nationalism is the sin that enables all its other sins. And that is, it has totally excised from its Bible the core of the gospel. No, I don't mean John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. No, I'm not talking about Romans, if you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that you will be saved. What I'm talking about is what Jesus said is the core of the gospel. In Matthew 22, he said, the greatest commandments that are equal in importance is to love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Without them both, you cannot have a cross. But on the social level, a horizontal level, the greatest commandment is to love our neighbors as ourselves. And what does that mean? Is that just some kind of sentimentalism, give your neighbor a holy hug? No, it is profound and radical in its implications, because what it says is that we are called to not only want, but to struggle for others as we would struggle for ourselves and our own loved ones, the same rights, freedoms, resources that we want for ourselves. That means that we are to struggle for justice in this society for all people. That is what love is in actuality in this sense. And right-wing evangelicals ignore that. They don't believe in community except in their own in-group. Everyone else is outside of that circle of concern. This is anti-biblical, it's anti-gospel. It eschews and ignores the command, the greatest command, to love our neighbors as ourselves. In this sense, no matter what they say, no matter what they do, they are off base, and they are never going to really have at heart the welfare of all humanity. And in a society like this, a pluralistic society like America, if all you care about is those who believe as you do, the rest you want to make your subjects, that makes for unhealthiness, for hatred, for death. And in this sense, they are dangerous people. Not only that, their racism is so deadly because it is clear they want to crush in any way they can all those who would oppose their mythical vision of what America has been. And so we see this terrible attack on critical race theory by people, 99.9% of whom have no idea what it is and think that it can be taught in kindergarten when it's only taught in graduate schools and law schools. But there's another way, another aspect of their lack of belief that makes them anti-Christian and therefore dangerous, not only to the faith, but to the nation. And that is that they ignore what is presented to us as the foremost mode of judgment by Jesus and by God. And that is in Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And most of us know it. It says that if you have not tried to feed someone, to help someone, essentially to try to struggle for justice in this world, then you have not tried to help the least of these, and therefore the scripture says you will go to hell. They ignore that the scripture says that we will be judged not by whom we love, whom we seek to marry, but by whether we're trying to love others, whether we're trying to do justice in the world. And when you ignore that, that leaves room for a theology of death. That leaves room for a theology of hatred and vilification. So we are at this point that we must realize that Christian nationalism is not just a theological heresy, which it is a danger to the life and limb and fabric of American society. And we who believe in loving our neighbors, we who believe that God is the God of all people, we who believe that God is a God of love and justice, We must stand fast against this scourge, like our lives depend upon it, because many of our lives will. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hendricks. I appreciate it so much. A theology of death and a theology of hatred. It goes without saying, as you've said, that our lives are all at stake. And that is why, in part, why we're here tonight to have a conversation about the threat that we're facing, to dive a little bit deeper. This overview that you've been given by Dr. Obery Hendricks is powerful. And we are grateful because it is the foundation from which the rest of the conversation tonight will be built off of. But I hope, and based on some of the messages I've seen come through in the chat, as folks are hoping to share with their families and grateful for the words and wisdom shared tonight, that we can put this into action. I'm going to provide that framework as we enter into our panel, and I prepare to bring in our other panelists tonight, that this is not just an academic exercise. This is not just an intellectual, a stretching session and a cool, fun learning time for everyone here gathered, but this is an imperative and a mandate that we would receive this information and consider what might we do with what we have heard and learned tonight. How might we put into action everything that we have learned in light of the threat that is not too far from us? It might be our own family. It might be our neighbors. It might be your own pastor that is facilitating this movement in your community and the communities around yours. And so we must consider, what role might we play in opposing Christian nationalism. It is my great honor, thus, to introduce our other panelists this evening, who are two warriors and fighters, brilliant leaders in the cause to bring an end to the threat of Christian nationalism, and who have heard the call on their life to respond to the abuse of scripture and theology, to foment a nationalist identity that would take away not just our democracy, but all of our foundational rights. I want to begin by first introducing Amanda Tyler, who is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. She leads the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
And I would also then like to introduce Paul Raushenbush, recently appointed president and CEO of the Interfaith Alliance. Reverend Paul is president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance now, but for over 25 years, he has worked at the intersection of faith and public life with an emphasis on promoting interfaith relations and for the cause of a more just world. He has served in churches, academic institutions, media, and nonprofit, and is also an American Baptist minister. I do want to note, I think is important for us, before I first again welcome Amanda and Paul, that tonight we have a very Christian panel. That is not going to be the case for the rest of our convening, but I think it's important that we begin our conversation about Christian nationalism with a group of Christian leaders who have devoted their lives to bringing about to defending our rights and our democracy, and hopefully bringing an end to this threat. And so I want to begin with you, Amanda, and Paul, the same question, but I'll start with you, Amanda. Your initial responses to Dr. Hendricks' remarks.
Well, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and grateful for the invitation to be on this panel. And Dr. Hendricks, really powerful comments that have me thinking in new ways about Christian nationalism and about the threats to our democracy. I would start by saying I appreciated how you properly centered Jesus in your remarks, and in particular, the radical nature of Jesus and the message of the Gospels, and that radical message and call to our lives is what is so threatening to the powers of the state. That Christian nationalism seeks to domesticate our faith, Christianity, Jesus, into something that can be controlled. And that's because the message of the gospel is dangerous to the status quo. It was dangerous to the status quo in Jesus's time and has been ever since. And so it is, and it can be frankly dangerous to us as well. It's a hard call that we are called to do, to walk in Jesus's footsteps and to follow his example in our lives as well. It can be easier to associate ourselves with the powers of the state than to lead that faithful life. And so that's a temptation that we face. And it makes me think of a temptation that Jesus faced as well in the passages and all the gospels that talk about the temptation of Jesus to give away his ministry in order to seek power. Second, just a phrase that really caught my attention was that Christian nationalism is committed to dominating the world, not loving the world, and the centrality of love to our faith, and the fact that Christian nationalism seeks to replace the gospel of love with the idol of power. And my final reflection for now is, just to say that I thought you had an excellent definition of Christian nationalism. I couldn't write it down fast enough. It was a few sentences, but I thought it perfectly encapsulated the ideology. One place that I might find a little bit of difference, I think, was, suggesting, if you were, I don't know, but that it's the same as right-wing evangelicalism or evangelicals, just because I think there's certainly overlap. I'm not quibbling with that. But I believe that Christian nationalism is a problem for every Christian denomination, that American Christianity, because of the pervasive and persistent nature of Christian nationalism that's been in the American society since before there was a United States of America, that all of our theologies and practices have been impacted in some way by the poisonous ideology of Christian nationalism. And so, want to be sure that we leave room for self reflection in our traditions, even if we don't associate as a right-wing evangelical. And also, I want to give room for those who would think of themselves as a white evangelical or conservative evangelical, that you don't have to be associated with Christian nationalism, that to have some of those theological views doesn't necessarily mean that you want the government to privilege Christianity, and think that there is space in all denominations and iterations of Christianity for us to work to dismantle Christian nationalism.
No, that's no, your points are well taken, particularly this last point. Just I think that perhaps there should be a modifier in there, rabid Christian nationalism, or no, Christian nationalism is okay, but also rabid right-wing evangelicalism. Of course, not all evangelicals are right-wing. We know that. I mean, that some of the, historically, some of the most progressive, socially progressive people in America have been evangelicals, from the abolitionists against slavery on forward. But right-wing evangelicalism, I think right-wing evangelicalism is problematic in itself, right? Because one has to embrace certain tenets, or eschew certain tenets, in order to be in good standing with right-wing evangelicals. I don't know if that's clear, but that's. But also, you made a good point about about Jesus. You might notice that I didn't really deal with much theology. I dealt with this scripture, and in my book, I stress ethics, and I think that the ethics that that Jesus taught and represented, Mahatma Gandhi makes clear, universal. And I think that we should stress the importance of love and justice, and looking out for our neighbors, loving our neighbors, with all these profound economic and social and political implications. And in that way, we can embrace or be embraced by folk of other faiths or no faiths, as long as they are people of goodwill. So I think that's important. I didn't say that, but I think that's important, because we're losing this battle against right-wing, against Christian nationalism, rabid right-wing evangelicals, and we're going to have to get some compatriots, to fight with us, to stand against it. And if we get lost in theological cul-de-sacs, folk will shy away from us, thinking that we might slip into that which we are fighting against. So, anyway, those are some of my thoughts. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.
I've written your thoughts down for further consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I've also written some of those down, and we will circle back to some of that. I will do my best, even though I am a theologian by pedigree, to avoid taking us into those theological cul-de-sacs myself, though those are some of my favorite places to hang out. Paul, I'd love to bring you in for your response.
Well, again, like Amanda, I'm just really honored to be responding to Dr. Hendricks, and whose work I'm always inspired by and challenged by in the most productive way. And I just really appreciate this opportunity. I was struck by the term Christian supremacy, and how how resonant that was, and how repellent it is as an idea of an oxymoron for me as a Christian, but also as something that I acknowledge is really a reality, and I think something that.
Let me see it.
Yes, as many people who are not Christians are experiencing, but it is something that you mentioned, and I think it's really an important thing to keep as we keep the confluence with Christian supremacy and white supremacy kind of in tension with one another and in conversation with one another. I'm interested, if we had more time, like finding the multi-strains of Christian nationalism. You mentioned the really important history that led to Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, how earlier strains of the KKK in the 1920s responding to how that also is a stream that goes into this, our present moment. And I was also struck by the very specific juxtaposition of domination and love that you offered, which I think goes into the question of what in particular is most immediately threatening about Christian nationalism right now, which is the use of the court system and the ballot box to impose particular structures and of laws that are meant to restrict private morality, laws that are meant to impose a certain kind of morality on the majority of Americans that they may not hold, laws that are intended to restrict learning in schools, and these all to me seem to stem out of this juxtaposition of domination versus love. And so I feel like that's just a really helpful way to be thinking about that these all of these like all of these political machinations are ultimately rooted in an effort towards domination. The other thing, just the final thing I'll mention as a pastor and as someone who doesn't really want everybody to be a Christian, I'll acknowledge that. Like I'm totally fine with like my Jewish cousins being Jewish, and like I'm cool with all that. But I will say that one of the realities of Christian nationalism and other forms, you know, is that I think people are being introduced to Jesus in a very perverted form, and so are very easily rejecting who Jesus was, who Jesus has been claimed to be, and instead of understanding who Jesus is. And so I had the honor of talking to Barbara Williams Skinner yesterday on my show on State of Belief, and she like said, you know, the first time she had never like wanted to be around Jesus because she had never heard anybody talk about Jesus the way her eventual husband Skinner, Tom Skinner, did. And I think that right now there's just a whole generation of people who are just going to be so disgusted with, you know, they're not going to know anything about Jesus. They're just going to know about who their most vocal followers are and how they're, you know, anti-queer, anti-women, anti-Black people, anti-immigrant, you know, and I'm going to say like, who wants to be a Christian? And as someone who's like, you know, life is actually centered around that identity in many ways. It's a certain kind of trauma that I feel like I have to, you know, fight against every day. And I'm not trying to claim a pity party because it's much easier to be me than almost anyone. But it is a terrible assault on our faith. And I think you mentioned that as well in your remarks. And I just really wanted to lift that up as people who feel motivated, both as an effort to salvage our country, but also our faith tradition that feels like it's about, it is under siege.
Yeah, you bring up an important point, and that is, there's so much I wanted to say, and so much I said in the book that I could not get to. But the point you bring up in your last point is some of what we have to do to push back against this. And one of the main things that we have to do, I believe, is we have to present the radicality of Jesus ourselves. We have to push back, and we have to go back to basics. That means, and I'm not just saying this, maybe I am because I'm a biblical scholar, but we have to go to the text and go to the text and explain to people what the gospel of Jesus Christ really is about, and lift up, representative passages that really encapsulate the message that he's trying to give to the world. And that's, as you know my book, The Politics of Jesus. We talked about, that's what I tried to do, the politics of Jesus, but that was just one person's effort. We have to do much, much more of that, I think, lifting up what the gospel's about and pointing the people to chapter and verse, because when we do that, that is a direct pushback against the blather that those guys are spewing, because it contradicts, the Bible contradicts, or they contradict what the gospel says. So thank you for that. It's so good to see you as always, Paul. I gotta tell you.
Thank you. There are so many directions I want to take us in, and hopefully we can get to as many as possible. I do want to give a quick note, as I've been also simultaneously reading the chat. I'm really grateful for the lively conversation there. I want to provide a reminder to folks to remain respectful as you're dialoguing amongst each other and engaging with our speakers tonight. I did not want to begin. I had different ideas of where we would start, but based on how this conversation has begun to unfold, I did not want to begin with what I would call the potentially Pandora's box of the Christian nationalism conversation. Because I think we are all, and this is common in movement, right? We all come to the table with the same goal of preserving our rights, preserving democracy, and creating a free, liberative future for all. And in movement, you will have the same goals and you will have differences of opinion and thought. But I do think, and this is in part based on what has been shared among the three of y'all and part of the conversation I've seen in the chat, I think it's good to lead with this question. Are Christian nationalists Christians or not, right? When we look at from the insurrection, right, you see a lot of Christian symbols, and I'm partly looking at Amanda because I'm grateful for the report y'all produced on this. You see Christian symbols, but then if you look at the data that sociologists and others have produced, it shows that many of the people who identify as Christian nationalists, who would wear Christian symbols to violent forms of political violence like the insurrection and others, they themselves are not churchgoers consistently. From what the data shows us as a majority. They're not folks who pray daily. They're not folks who necessarily read scripture. And I'm thinking about what you shared, Dr. Hendricks, about presenting the radicality of Jesus out of the text, right? And showing that. How do we answer this question? Are these people Christian or not? And I have follow-up questions if we say yes or no. Are these people Christians? And what do we do with how we respond to that question? How do we deal with the reality that there are folks who identify proudly as Christian nationalists who may or may not themselves fit a definition of Christianity?
I'll start out if that's okay. So I would say first, this idea of self-identifying as a Christian nationalist, that is a really new phenomenon, at least from how I've been tracking this over the last 3+ years in depth since we started Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Earlier, there was much more of a tendency among those who most embraced Christian nationalism to, one, deny that it existed at all, and to two, say that we were engaged in name calling by even thinking about calling them Christian nationalist. Now, that was particularly directed at me because I never call anyone a Christian nationalist because I believe that Christian nationalism is an ideology that impacts us all. I think I rely pretty heavily on sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who have written extensively and studied this as an ideology that, Americans are on a spectrum from totally embracing it to completely rejecting it, with the majority of Americans being somewhere in the middle. And so I just wanted to kind of lay that groundwork. So then to actually answer the question, like, are these people Christians or not? Well, I guess it depends on exactly who we're talking about. You mentioned the people at the Capitol, for instance, and the instances of Christian nationalism there. I think as far as how do we define that, people who go to church, there were certainly people, at the Capitol who aren't churchgoers, and those who most strongly embrace Christian nationalism who aren't. And from my perspective, and this is just, I just never like to call someone saying that they're a Christian or not. I just don't I just don't do that. I let people kind of self-identify. Now, the question that I'm pushing people to ask themselves is how much of what you're practicing or calling Christianity really looks more like Christian nationalism. Absolutely. And a good question for that, I think, is what you think of as patriotism, is it causing you to sacrifice your theological convictions? At that point, you're not a patriot. You've become you're become a nationalist and possibly Christian nationalist. So
Mm.
I think there's a temptation to say those people who are most embracing Christian nationalism are just not Christians. And I think I'm just not there because I think I've got to be, I think we have to be self-reflective about all of our, if we are Christian, how we think about our own Christianity first.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. I only point to you because you and your team did a lot of incredible work on that report on the connection between the insurrection and Christian nationalism more broadly. So thank you. Others
Thank you.
Want to jump in, and we can share that link also. We will find that and drop it in the chat. Paul, Dr. Hendricks?
I actually really appreciate Amanda's what Amanda said. I'll underscore that I think saying these people are not Christian lets Christians off the hook a little bit, and I you know, it's almost too easy. But you know, I mean, the reality is like this is, you know, if we just look to Russia, just one example. You could look at, you know, you could look to lots of different countries for a kind of Christian nationalist that has a parallel, and you know, then you start to realize, oh, there's something about this toxic blend of faith and kind of you know, nationalism that they lend themselves to one another. And they offer excuses for one another, and they offer like legitimization of one another, and they're both rooted in a desire for power. And so I just, you know, I worry saying that, oh, these people are not Christian, because then we're kind of writing off, you know, we're saying like, oh, well, the majority of the people in the world are not Christian. I think we are. There's always been this struggle in the church. Like, what is the church about, and what is it supposed to be about? You know, who are we for? Who are we with? What is our goal? You know, and so I think Amanda said it very, very well. And as much as I would like to say, you know, blasphemer, you know, and you know, it just seems too easy for me, and it also lets me off the hook a little bit too easy, as I think about what you know, where my co-religionists are.
And
I think that you make I agree with both of you. For instance, I mean, how can anyone say that even though Jerry Falwell was a racist, how can you say he's not a Christian? You know, I think though we do have to have some kind of yardstick or standard, and I'm not, you know, I think that you know, that we have to we can say that people's actions or proclamations are not consistent with what the gospel says. I mean, we can do that oftentimes, you know, objectively, and that's what I try to do. But to get into who is a Christian and who's not a Christian, I don't see how I can get to that. I think that's a dead end anyway, you know. You know, and it smacks too much of doing what they do on the other side, you know. I'm gonna just write people off and deem out, you're not a Christian. Well, yeah, I mean, there's Christianity of faith, but they're Christians of faith, and then they're ideological Christians. And you know, we have to look at that too, you know, folk who's define their Christianity through the prism of their own interests and needs and desires. So you're right. I mean, I agree with both of you. It's not simple. I would not engage in that. It's too difficult, and it's really a waste of time ultimately. You know, end up fighting over something that you fight that no one can win.
And I appreciate you all tackling the question, and part of my motivation, my thought, even ahead of tonight, and bringing the question to us, is that so much of this conversation publicly has emphasized a distancing of Christians who don't identify with Christian nationalism on the one hand, pointing over here and saying, no, that's those Christian nationalists, they're not real Christians. And I think to like very much like what you've all have named is it's not our, it's first, I don't think it's our job, right? I'm in agreement with it. It's not our job to determine, both from an organizing perspective, but also from a theological perspective, it's not our duty to determine for someone else whether their faith is legitimate or not, right? And as a queer person of faith, right, having had that, having had my life, my existence, my faith questioned because of that, I'm appreciative of the, no, I will let you determine for yourself between you and God, however you define divinity, what your faith means. It's not my responsibility. And to what we should, so it's not our role to let anyone off the hook by freeing someone from Christian identity. I think off of that, I want to go back in time a little bit before jumping into.
May I ask you before you go there? Just quickly.
Yes, sir.
Now I'm wondering if any of this was in response to my using the term anti-Christian, ideology. I'm not suggesting that these folk that they're not, that they don't identify with Christians, but I think we can identify what is anti-Christian, just like First John did. That's why
Absolutely.
I just want to get that straight. I'm not in a position to, I don't want to look like I said one thing. I was calling them Christians, and then I'm agreeing with my colleagues, to be politically correct. No, that was not the case.
Absolutely. I want to go back in time a little bit before getting to some data. So I'll mention the data right now, and you can tie this into your responses here. Today, the Pew Research Center released a fresh report that we will drop in the chat for folks to read. It's about 60 odd pages, but the headline is that 45% of Americans say that the US should be a Christian nation. Now, once you get into the weeds of the data, you see like the level of influence that folks desire, right, the church to have on the function of state, what folks believe about the separation of church and state, and to what degree that separation should exist or not. It gets much more complicated, but the top line really is 45% of Americans say that the US should be a Christian nation. Many believe, right, that the US was founded as such at its onset. The issue of Christian nationalism from a historic perspective, I believe, is tied to an imperial thread that goes, and in many ways, Dr. Hendricks, you spoke to some of this, an imperial thread that goes back to some of the earliest days of the Christian church, where there was at some point a desire to say there will be more power for us as a religious body, as a religious group, as a religious movement, if we have control over the state. We see that happen in Rome. We see that much in the development of Christianity and the nation state in Europe throughout history. And then its impact on decisions surrounding the Catholic Church's doctrine of discovery, European, both Catholic and Protestant engagement, and in the development of white supremacist ideology, which results in the transatlantic slave trade, and much of the white supremacist racist history we have experienced as a nation since. Much of Christian history in Europe and the US and elsewhere, but primarily in Europe and Europe descendant churches and church movements, has been connected to dominance, control, or significant influence over the state that we, I believe, see now reflected in this data, where once again, 45% of Americans today say that the US should be a Christian nation. How do you respond to this new data? And how do we handle this historic thread we see in European and American Christianity that is so connected to dominion and influence over the state? Paul, how about you jump in first?
I'll say I think that the data was mixed in that. I am really I think there are people for whom this question, is America a Christian nation? I can imagine a lot of non-Christians replying, well, yeah, because as a Jew, everything seems to be centered around Christmas. And I just think that I'm curious what people mean by it. I think it does not indicate an overwhelming support of Christian nationalism per se, and I think some of the other in the report they linked to another report that Pew did last year about that something like 80% believe in a strong separation of church and state, and that our Constitution was written by people and should be treated as something written by people to be interpreted. And so I just want to make sure that we don't overstate what this particular poll said. That the headline was very worrisome. However, I think we have an education problem here, education challenge, I'll put, in that I actually, one of the things that I think is most positive about the founding of the country was the sense that there was no state religion. And actually that there was that some of the people who we identify with the founding of this country said, were sent very reassuring notes to the synagogue in Providence, and that Mohammedans should be able to preach so there were, I think that in Philadelphia. So my sense is that we need to reclaim the story of the founding of the country as actually a country that at its founding had many people who were no religion. The idea that everybody's running around as a happy Christian is equally false, that there were many people who held no religious faith at all who were here. We've had many great awakenings. So, and the fact is that many people in this country were not religious at the time of the founding. And then there were some who were, and this tension has been here from the start. So there's a myth out there that we were founded as a Christian nation, and we come to pilgrims, and there's all sorts of ways that this has influenced the history of race in this country and subjugation. But I think in part we need to just continue to remind each other that actually at the founding of this country, there were people of all different races, and this is something that we should be very proud of, and that we should be protecting in the face of what we see as people who are claiming that this is a Christian nation, and that therefore Christians should be privileged, and also that we have to preserve it. Otherwise, God will rescind God's favor, as if God worked in that sort of churlish way. So there's a lot of theological work to do, but even more important, there's a lot of history that needs to be clearly stated.
I appreciate that, Paul, and I also think that it has a lot to do with people's understanding about what it means to be, a Christian nation. Because I recall when I was 12 and I discovered Marxism, I remember telling my parents, I was raised in the church, right? My father's a trustee and all that, and I was baptized very young. But when I encountered Marxism, I mean, so much of it, well, rudimentary, Marxism, so much it resonated with me. I remember telling my parents at age 12 that I was no longer a Christian. And to them, that meant that I was going to be, a serial killer, that I no longer have a moral compass that I could. In other words, what I'm getting at is that there are those who do define Christianity as being a Christian nation just based on basic good morality, and we should just be a good country that has good values, that doesn't mess over folk. And I would think that might be what they mean by that. But I must also say that if many of the folk are thinking that way, then we need to ask them, why is it only 45%? maybe I'm not right on that. Maybe.
I'm just going to do a slight intervention. You mentioned Marxism and Christianity, and one of the books that my great grandfather wrote was Christianizing the Social Order, by which he really meant bringing Marxism to counteract the excesses of capitalism. So there's lots of ways that you could imagine what that could mean to various people, as it has throughout the ages.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I agree with you both. I think that top line, I was really concerned when I saw that top line, and then I felt marginally better after reading, although I do think that I think our work is certainly cut out for us on an educational front. I do think that we are a Christian nation can be just a demographic reality, that a majority of Americans do still identify as Christian. But also, Dr. Hendricks, as you talked about it, this ethics of love and justice, if that's what people think the Christianity stands for, then they aspire for us to be a country that reflects love and justice. And that certainly is aspirational, but it does still point to what Dr. Eddie Glaude has called the gap between who we are and who we say we are. And so I think we see that here, where you have people, so strongly identifying as a Christian nation, at the same time still defending the separation of church and state. And that does show that gap between this ideal that has been present in our founding documents and the reality of Christian nationalism that's been running alongside. But the data does show that there is still very little understanding about Christian nationalism as an ideology. They said that more than half of the people who responded had heard nothing at all about Christian nationalism. 14% said they'd heard a little, 17% had heard some, and only 9% had heard quite a bit. 5% had heard a great deal about Christian nationalism. So I think that shows us where our education is. And I do think it's important that people understand Christian nationalism and what it means, because of its urgent threat to American democracy, its threat to Christianity, and also, as I've said, it's the single biggest threat to religious freedom that we face today. So I think in order to fight against something, you have to understand what it is. And the fact that such a tiny percentage of these respondents had even heard or very much about Christian nationalism shows us that our education and public talk about Christian nationalism needs to be intensified. The last point I'll make right now about the poll that was really striking to me and plays into comments we've already heard tonight is about the Supreme Court. For the first time ever, they asked in this survey if Supreme Court justices have relied on their religious beliefs too much in their recent decisions. It struck me that it's the first time they felt like they needed to ask that question. And then when asked, 44% of the respondents said they had relied too much on their religious beliefs in issuing their decisions. One of those foundational ideals of religious freedom for all is our government will remain neutral when it comes to religion, that religious belief won't influence decisions by the government. And the fact that 44% of Americans don't think that's the case with the US Supreme Court is incredibly alarming and something that I think we should be paying attention to here.
I think that's particularly the case when it comes to abortion, right?
Yeah.
I appreciate it a lot, as I think there are two things, right? Like, I think it's helpful, one, to be sober about what are we really facing, right? Is this beast, especially for folks who might be closer to the issue, is this beast as big as we think it is? Is it as scary and as threatening and as dangerous as it is? Or is it much smaller? I'd love for y'all to engage that question, right? Like, what is the to what degree should people not be afraid? Because I don't want the takeaway to be sensationalism. I don't want the takeaway to be fear, and that no one here would do that at all. But I want to know if we can provide folks a real sense of what is the danger. Because even when I look at this data, and I'm with you, fully aligned, right? Like the top line, headline, kind of scary, meant to draw attention. You get into the weeds, and it's much more complicated dynamic from question to question, and covers a full array. But what we do know, both from the US and throughout history, is that a small group of devoted individuals seeking dominion have often been successful. The white supremacist movements are not large movements, and yet they have been overwhelmingly successful in their capacity to dominate, to segregate, to impact harm and political violence. And so as much as there's a sober reality of like, well, not that many people think that conservative evangelical Christianity and those who, conservative Catholicism and others who would align themselves with Christian nationalism, it's a small group of them that are pushing a Christian nationalist agenda and think the US should be a Christian nation that fits the kind of scary, terrifying, fearful image that I think a lot of us have a lot of folks are taking away. It's a small number, and so maybe it's not as overwhelming. It's not like look over your shoulder when you walk through your neighborhood, but the truth is also that conservative evangelicals have also focused a lot of energy in voter turnout, because they know that even though their numbers as percent of the population might be insignificant in comparison to the larger whole, that if you have a larger turnout of voters or a larger turnout of engagement within that minority, that you can have a significant impact on the political outcomes in the country. So there is a sobriety to be had on the reality that there might be a small percentage that are pushing this ideology, but small numbers have been successful. It's a lot of fluff there to simply say, I mean, what is your threat assessment? What should people really be taking away in terms of the threat that is looming? We've all talked in terms of, in varying degrees, in terms of threat to our democracy, threats to religious freedom, threats to our rights. And then what ought people do? And we'll answer those questions. Well, have you answer that, and then we'll move to audience questions after.
You know, I think that first, those who have enforced white supremacy in America for the longest time were not a minority. It was the majority of folk, because and they benefited from it. And of course, there's still many who would like to see that same status quo. I think the demonization is very dangerous. I think that the threat is very dangerous when you have, I was in the heart of Georgia with my wife. She's doing some research for an article, and I saw these bumper stickers about how liberals are evil, you know, Democrats are the devil, you know, they want to destroy America, this, and I mean, stuff that, you know, can and has pushed people to hurt other people. And we've seen that with some of these, you know, these serial killings. I think it's, without question, it's getting worse. They're getting much bolder. You know, if you look at the internet, they're getting much bolder with the things that they say. Much bolder in the way that they act. You know, hopefully it looks like things have slowed down in terms of the attacks on Asians. But you know, when Trump was talking about the China flu, I mean, you know, old women were getting literally beaten to death. And so I think it's dangerous. I think it's particularly dangerous for those most easy to identify as different, and those with brown skin. I think that queer folk, you know, are at danger too, and you know, if you know, if they identify themselves as such. I guess what I'm really just saying is this: I don't think that America really realizes just how dangerous this time is. When you have folk talking, when you have folk who attack the Capitol and who are talking about killing this one and that one, and when you have miscreants like Marjorie Taylor Greene, the highest heights of government, talking that kind of crazy, hateful stuff, and you have Donald Trump who's saying more hateful stuff every day, that there, and also we're finding that there are a lot of people, a lot of police and military who are supporters, racist, are racist and supporters of MAGA as well. I have a student who was in intelligence in the Marines, and he said that the hatred and the racism is just scary. These are people who use guns. One other thing, most of those who have been involved in the recent spate of terrorists, serious killers, have had some relationship to the military, even if it's just ROTC. So all of this, we have all these things arrayed against us, and not only that, they're winning the discursive battle, the dialogical battle. They're we are on the run. So that is to say that if the left does not really stand up and stand against this, but also try to build some kind of discursive bridges, excuse me, I think that we're really going to see some really frightening times. I hope not, but it just seems at the way we're going that it's just unavoidable.
Yeah, I agree. I think I am not alarmist, and I am incredibly alarmed. And I do think that January 6th was an absolute wake-up call to a lot of us about just how dire the threat to democracy is and how close we came. I did put a link in the chat to how Christian nationalism worked to unify the people who came to the Capitol that day, how it was used in all of the lead up events to January 6th, starting right after Election Day and leading up, and how once they were there, it bolstered their action in order to kind of take what had been a political cause and make it into a religious cause in their minds as well, that they were willing to die for that day, and how that can really threaten our democracy. Of course, the threat to human life. We began tonight remembering the victims at Tree of Life Synagogue, how Christian nationalism worked, was influenced that extremist to kill 11 Jews, remains the deadliest attack on Jews in the United States ever. And that we have so many other examples, leading all the way up to the top supermarket in Buffalo earlier this year. So it is a dangerous ideology that kills people. And we also have to be alarmed, I think, that politicians are winning on a message of Christian nationalism and then working to bring Christian laws into their policies. And I've been doing quite a bit of traveling around the country and learning more in depth on the ground from people about what's happening in places like Oklahoma and Florida, where the governor is rewriting civics curriculum to say that separation of church and state doesn't exist. And this is a really strategic move on their part, because they know when you look at survey data, younger generations are much less likely to embrace Christian nationalism than older generations. And so they are indoctrinating our youngest citizens into this ideology of Christian nationalism to try to further put the roots of this ideology. So I think we have to be alarmed on all levels about Christian nationalism, and to do so. I'm not saying that to make us afraid. I'm saying that to urge us to take action and to understand how this is impacting our communities and how it's we are at a point, we've mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene, but there are others who are openly embracing not only the label of Christian nationalist, but advocating to end separation of church and state and to have Christian dominance in law and policy. So we're at a point of this being normalized. If those of us who care about these democratic institutions don't stand up, then we are at risk of losing them.
Thank you both. I want to add, just build off of what you were just saying right there, Amanda. There was a quote from former Vice President Mike Pence from just yesterday. A man he himself was a target of the insurrectionists on January 6th, but said yesterday, well, the radical left believes that the freedom of religion is the freedom from religion, but it's nothing the American founders ever thought of or generations of Americans fought to defend. In response to the interviewer Kudlow, who said the lefties want to scrap religion, and Mike Pence, and I think it's a terrible mistake. There's this boldness, which I think is what I meant to get at when I mentioned a minority of folks who are perhaps more outward in their white supremacy or outward in their Christian nationalism. A lot of people love to hold it tight and in secret until it's more convenient to otherwise. But now you have folks like Mike Pence who are, in addition to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who probably has a closet full of t-shirts that now say, I'm a proud Christian nationalist. Folks like Mike Pence and others who continue to advance this narrative that says, no, freedom of religion does not mean freedom from religion. And we can deduce from what we know of these folks that what they mean particularly freedom from a particular specific brand of Christianity. What is the risks that we face? And Paul, you can add on to the previous question as well. Like, what are the risks that we face to religious freedom? There was a question about, is Christian nationalism part of freedom of religion? Shouldn't that just be a part of our understanding of freedom of expression? That folks should have a liberty to express themselves vis-a-vis Christian nationalism. Can we get a definition for everyone attending on what we mean when we say religious freedom and how Christian nationalism is inherently opposed to what we understand as true religious freedom?
Well, I'll offer some remarks, but I think that I think probably, and I'm really glad it kind of came up at the end, the attack on democracy and the attack on religious freedom that Christian nationalism poses. I think Christian nationalism, democracy is fine until it gets in the way. We saw that with all the election denying that has gone on, the big lie, and then all the small lies across the country. It's just incredible because they didn't win. Now they're lying about it, and because democracy was inconvenient because they lost. And I think that more and more that's going to become just that. They've already, I mean, I hate to say it, and I hate to make this partisan, but there have become, like, it's become almost standard to say, if I lose, it's because it was rigged. That, if you're starting to say that now, it means that you don't trust democracy, and you're undermining democracy with every opportunity you have. So my colleagues have said more eloquent things about democracy, but I feel like democracy is central to the question. You know, I don't want to keep going back to Trump's favorite person, Putin, but democracy is not convenient for Putin, and so he got rid of it. And right now, that is a Christian nationalist, and that's like, I think that's the reason they're so enamored of Russia. The other thing I'll say about religious freedom is, I absolutely, our definition of religious freedom, which I think is influenced by lots of people who have done great work on this, is religious freedom is a sacred, maybe sacred value of our country, but it is not without its limits. And when my religious freedom impacts your ability to exercise your religious freedom, then we have to talk about it. And so it is not without limits. And religious freedom, and I think what we're seeing with Christian nationalism is that it is religious freedom for a few without limits to impose their religious view on the rest of us. So we're seeing this very clearly in the abortion debate, where different religions differ on abortion and how that happens. And yet one religious tradition has managed through the Supreme Court to impact everybody else's religious freedom on this important personal morality issue. We're going to see the same thing with same-sex marriage, which is going to be undermined by the Supreme Court. We're seeing the same thing with conception coming up, and we're seeing so this is impacting the religious freedom of the majority by the minority, and that's, you know, it impacts my freedom as a Christian who does not agree with this Christian, you know, this thin national. So I think that I find it, and just I feel like we are in a. I can see how democracy, as I've assumed it would be maintained for my 58 years, begins a fairly radical disintegration within the next 4 years.
I appreciate that. I want to throw in a question, some commentary from the audience that has been interesting to track as this conversation has unfolded. We've spoken about the reality of the threat that we're facing. I appreciate the way you framed that, Amanda, of like, I'm not an alarmist, but I'm alarmed. And likewise, I feel similarly. And I think many folks that work in this field are generally cautious people about jumping to conclusions, right? And yet there's a conversation taking place in the chat about whether or not this movement, around combating Christian nationalism, is propaganda to raise money for the left, if it's propaganda to kind of bring more attention to the religious left, or if it's a real threat. I know you've answered this in many ways, but I want to address, because this is just something that's a repeated theme in the chat. There are people that will simply not be convinced as we try to ransom our democracy from the threats that we're facing. And there are people who will be unconvinced by our attempts to separate Christianity as a faith from those who self-identify as Christians and also push a Christian nationalist ideology. What message do you give to people who have doubt still that this is a threat that we face?
I mean,
Can I? Oh, go ahead, Dr. Hendricks. Did you?
no, I mean, it's like, pay attention. I mean, just pay attention to the news and the internet, and I mean, pay attention. Go ahead, Amanda.
Well, I was just going to say, I want to make clear, you know, from I think all of our perspectives, and certainly the perspective of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, this isn't a left movement to oppose Christian nationalism. This is across the board movement to oppose Christian nationalism. It is going to take all of us to stand up against this ideology, including asking those people who are most embracing it to step away from Christian nationalism, because it is bad for Christianity, it is bad for American democracy. If you are an American patriot, you should be opposing Christian nationalism, no matter who you're voting for, what your political, perspective is. And if that is the impression that's being sent, I think it behooves all of us to be even more exact in our definitions and our understandings of what Christian nationalism is. Dr. Hendricks gave an excellent definition in his talk. You asked for some definitions, Michael. I define Christian nationalism as a political ideology and cultural framework that tries to merge our identities as Americans and Christians into one, suggesting that only that true Americans are all Christians, and really Christians who hold a certain set of political positions on moral issues. And then Christianity, on the other hand, is a religion. And that was one of your questions, Michael, was, well, don't people who espouse Christian nationalism have a right to their beliefs? Well, I would say not from a religious freedom perspective, because Christian nationalism is not a religion. Do they have a right to free expression and free speech? Sure. Do they have a religious freedom right to have, does anyone have a religious freedom right to have the government's laws reflect their theological views? No, they don't. And so that's where we have to be exact. And again, the religious freedom definition is that we are free to believe or not and act on our beliefs or not without the unnecessary interference of the government. And that without the unnecessary interference of the government is to Paul's point, that none of our rights are absolute, that we live in a pluralistic society and have to think about how our exercise of religion impacts other people's exercise of religion. So I think that we need to be clear and careful in our definitions if we aren't, because we don't want to send the message at all that this is a left versus right issue. This is an American issue. And for those of us who are Christians, also a Christian issue.
And a political issue, right? Because like you said, we're opposing a destructive ideology, an ideology that really wants to destroy democracy as we know it. And so, I mean, I think that, I mean, they have a right to say what they believe, but we have a right to point out the fascistic underpinnings of it as well. And in fact, we have a responsibility as American citizens and believers in the gospel. We have a gospel responsibility. So, so yes, they have freedom to do that, but we have freedom and responsibility to point out just how deleterious it is. And that's part of the problems for me is that, the way I was raised in the Christian church, and many of my contemporaries in the Black church have said they raised the same ways, like, speak no ill, of folk, don't, be long-suffering, be peaceful, this understanding what it means to turn the other cheek. And so we end up not calling things out for what they are. But, and that's holding us back. We have to remember these folk are winning right now. They're winning, and their goal is a very destructive one to everyone on this panel and all our loved ones and the things that we believe in. So yeah, they have a right to go to a certain extent, but at a certain point, we have a responsibility to push back on them. And be honest with you, I'm less concerned with making sure that I push back at the exact right time than I am concerned with making sure that I do push back, if that makes sense.
I really appreciate what my colleagues are saying. The only thing I'll offer is we also have the benefit of a more beautiful vision. And I think the more that we in addition to calling out, we cast a vision.
Yes.
Cast a vision for what we hope for, which is actually where people of all faith traditions and no faith traditions are treated with dignity and justice, which include conservative Christians. It includes everybody. And we have a vision of a society where past wrongs are righted. And there's a way that we can move forward actually with equity and justice and love. And, so I think going back to one of the things that Dr. Hendricks said at the very beginning, which is like, what is the love that we can offer and truly build upon the greats of our society, King being the most important of them, which is like, who really he didn't shy away from a vision for the society. He didn't shy away from the word love. He didn't shy away from the word justice and the invitation to this better future. And so when you match up this kind of compressed, anger and domination versus an expansive love, welcome, powerful vision, I offer that as something I'm trying to remember to do. And every time I talk about this, which is not just to say this is why it's so terrible what's going on, but also imagine what would happen and what we can do. And so I just offer that as probably my closing remark.
Yeah, may I just say this in my book I took note of a saying of Jesus in the Gospel of John that I have other sheep that are not of this fold. In fact, I spent a chapter on that. And yeah, and that's absolutely right, because what we're talking about is people of the same kind of goodwill, no matter what they say they believe or don't say they believe, coming together and building a just world. Part of that, though, is evolving ways to understand, identify who these people are and who they are not. I mean, unfortunately, we do have to separate, and this is a terrible analogy, but it's biblical, separate the sheep from the goats, at least ideologically. So I just wanted to offer that. Don't hold it against me, right?
It's all right. No, I appreciate all of this, and I appreciate Paul, particularly the drawback to Dr. King, in the spirit of Mahalia Jackson, telling them about the dream. Tell them about the dream, Martin, right? That was the words, the impetus for the I have a dream, right?
That's true.
A dream that rises up in community, a dream that rises up from the labor, in particular in that moment, the labor and spiritual fortitude of Black women. But what draws us together, right, our community, right, and the hope for what a community would look like that is safe, just, and equitable for all, has been at the root and heart, I believe, of this discussion tonight, that we could move in a direction that is safer for everyone, that takes into an account the real threat that we face, the threat our democracy faces, the threat our rights face, and that we would move into action in response to that threat, that this is not make-believe, that folks don't find pleasure in creating fear, but that we are moving in response to real threat in hopes to preserve the safety of our communities and move our communities towards flourishing, free from the assault that we are facing. I want to thank you all so much for the brilliant, thoughtful conversation. I want to thank you for the hard work that you've put in, not just for the time tonight, but tonight is just part of an overflow of the incredible work that you all have done in the movement to protect our democracy, in a movement to protect true religious freedom, in a movement to protect women and the LGBTQ+ community and ethnic and racial minorities and all others who are at risk of losing their rights in the face of this onslaught. Thank you so much. It has been an honor to get to speak with you tonight. And I want to invite back Dr. Sabrina Dent to close us for the evening. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. What a powerful discussion. I want to first thank Dr. Obery Hendricks for your keynote that got us started this evening, and Amanda Tyler, as well as Paul Raushenbush, and our wonderful moderator, Michael Vazquez. There was so much that was said this evening, and I'm not going to do a summary because they have said it all. Your responsibility now is to take the information that you heard, to noodle on it, think about it, think about what is your responsibility in your community, in your context, to address Christian nationalism, or even develop a deeper understanding of it. As Michael stated, there was a lot happening in the chat and a lot of conversations going back and forth, and that says that there's room for us to continue to engage in dialogue, and we will do so. So one of the things I want to say, and I thank Dr. Hendricks for stating this about Christian nationalism is a danger to life and the life and limb of democracy. And then to that, I want to add one of the comments that Michael stated, said, this is not make-believe. And so tomorrow's discussions will show you how this is not make-believe. For tomorrow, we will be focusing on our theme for the next couple of days of reimagining religious freedom, rights, responsibilities, and respect. And we'll start at 10 a.m. with a panel discussion that will focus on the legal implications when the rights of any particular group are threatened due to religious privilege. So that conversation that happened tonight, you'll see even more why it's critically important for us to pay attention and then to take action. And as you can see, our incredible panelists will be Andrea Miller with the Center for Common Ground, Reverend Alex Patchen McNeil, who's an ordained minister and an LGBTQ activist. Also, we'll have Liz Reiner Platt with the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School, Mandisa Thomas, who is the founder of Black Nonbelievers, and I am honored to moderate this panel discussion. And then we will, at 12:45 tomorrow, we don't have that slide up, but at 12:45, we'll have a musical presentation by Vaughn Ambrose with Yellow Door Concert. And that will lead us back to this 1 p.m. session about reimagining religious freedom responsibilities. So you wonder, like, who's addressing these issues and how are organizations addressing these issues? This is the panel for you to join as well. As you can see, we have Victoria Kirby York, who is with the National Black Justice Coalition, Nicole Lee, who is a former youth organizing fellow with American United, also Lo Reliford, who is the political director at Sojourners. We have Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who is with the National Council of Jewish Women, and this conversation will be moderated by Reverend Jamar Boyd II, who's with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. So again, we don't want you to miss these sessions. And then we'll close out our Friday afternoon at 3:45 with the panel about respect. What does it mean for us to do this work of protecting religious freedom and upholding this responsibility, but then finding ways to collaborate with one another? And so we have a panel of individuals that come from many multi-faith and diverse worldviews that are working on projects, pluralism projects, and justice issues. And so we'll have with us PJ Andrews, who is the Race Discourse Officer for the Baha'is of the United States Public Affairs Office, Dr. Brad Braxton, who is the president of Chicago Theological Seminary, and also the pastor of the Open Church of Maryland. Additionally, we have Harmeet Kamboj, who is an interfaith educator and performing artist, along with Becca Tyvel, who is with Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. And this conversation will be moderated by our very own board member and Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, who is the upcoming interim dean for the Wake Forest School of Divinity. So again, another powerful conversation. As Michael mentioned earlier, it is critically important that we take in this information, but we also see who are the stakeholders, who are the organizations, in addition to the ones that were featured tonight with the BJC, as well as Interfaith Alliance and the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, and the work that Dr. Hendricks is doing at Columbia University. Who are the additional people that are doing this work and addressing Christian nationalism? So with that, I want to say thank you for joining us this evening. This video will be available at a later time for you to go back and revisit. And if you have further questions, we encourage you to email us and we'll send you the link for tomorrow's sessions. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.